She came here for peace, but found herself trapped in the most dangerous game of all: obsession. A rising star in the art world, Brielle Carter had everything ahead of her: fame, success, and a future filled with possibility. But on the night of October 28th, inside the walls of one of the most exclusive wellness retreats in New York, that future was stolen from her in the most brutal way imaginable. She checked in alone. She never checked out. By morning, the corridors of the Hampton Springs retreat were no longer a sanctuary, but a crime scene. A body lay lifeless in one of its luxury suites. A name whispered in shock and disbelief among the staff: Brielle Carter. But this wasn't a robbery. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. And the man responsible? He had already vanished into the night. His name was Malcolm Rhodes, a wealthy art patron, a man of influence, a man Brielle once trusted, a man she once loved. But when admiration turns to control, and control spirals into obsession, love can become a death sentence. How did a woman at the height of her career fall victim to the very man who claimed to support her? And why did Malcolm Rhodes take his own life before he could ever face justice? Tonight, we uncover the chilling truth behind a fatal obsession and a love that was never meant to last. Brielle Carter was more than an artist. She was a voice, a presence, a force that demanded attention in a world that often ignored women like her. At just 32, she had carved out a space for herself in the competitive world of contemporary art, not by fitting in, but by refusing to. She was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia, in a home filled with books, music, and the kind of conversations that pushed boundaries. Her mother, a teacher, encouraged her to question everything. Her father, a musician, showed her the power of expression. And from an early age, Brielle knew she wanted to create, to be heard, to be seen. At 17, she left for New York City with little more than a portfolio and an ambition that wouldn't let her stop. She studied, she struggled, she worked jobs that had nothing to do with art just to keep a roof over her head. And yet, she never stopped painting. Her work was raw, unapologetic, bold strokes, unfiltered emotion. It was about identity, about the struggle of being a black woman in spaces that weren't built for her. It was about power, about control, about the things people were too afraid to say out loud. She built her reputation one piece at a time. First, small gallery shows. Then, a breakthrough. Critics took notice. Collectors began buying. She co-founded Vision Noir, an art magazine dedicated to amplifying black artists. She was changing the conversation. And for the first time in her life, it felt like she had made it. Then she met Malcolm Rhodes. Malcolm was 55, a self-made millionaire, a man who understood power because he had spent decades accumulating it. A real estate mogul with an eye for luxury, he built his wealth designing spaces that only the wealthiest could afford. He was respected, connected, a man who knew the right people and had the resources to open doors most artists would never get close to. He was also a man who had built his entire life on control. To those who knew him, Malcolm was a patron of the arts, a generous benefactor who took pride in supporting young, talented artists. His name was attached to gallery openings, exhibitions, foundations. He moved through New York's art scene like he owned it because in many ways he did. But his generosity came with a price. And for those who accepted his help, that price was submission. Before Brielle, there had been others. Women, young, ambitious, talented, who had been drawn in by his charm, his influence, his ability to make things happen. And when those women decided they wanted something he wasn't willing to give them, freedom, independence, distance, things changed. There were whispers. Stories of careers that stalled without warning. Artists who suddenly disappeared from the scene. Women who, after breaking ties with Malcolm, found that the opportunities once promised to them were now closed off. But Brielle didn't know that then. Or maybe she did, but she thought she would be different. By the time she realized how tightly Malcolm had woven himself into her life, it was already too late. So she did the only thing she could. She ran. She needed time. Space. A place where she could think clearly, away from the constant calls, the unexpected visits, the feeling that she was being watched. So she packed a bag and left the city. No explanations, no warnings. On October 26, 2024, Brielle checked into the Hampton Springs Retreat, a secluded luxury resort in Watermill, New York. It was the kind of place designed for escape, private villas, meditation gardens, silence. A place where no one could reach her unless she wanted them to. She checked in alone. She never expected Malcolm to follow. But Malcolm always found a way to get what he wanted. 2 days later, on the evening of October 28th, Malcolm Rhodes walked into the lobby of the Hampton Springs retreat. He didn't have a reservation. He didn't need one. He knew how to get past barriers, how to make people believe he belonged anywhere he went. And that night, there was only one place he wanted to be. Hours later, Brielle Carter was dead. October 28, 2024. The Hampton Springs retreat was silent. The kind of silence only found in places designed for isolation. The sun had just started its slow rise over Water Mill, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. The resort was waking up. But in room 214, nothing stirred. At 10:45 a.m., a housekeeper made her way down the hall, pushing a service cart filled with fresh towels and linens. She stopped outside room 214, checked her clipboard. The guest inside, Brielle Carter, had requested privacy the day before. No disturbances. No housekeeping. But now checkout time was approaching and she hadn't made any requests for an extension. She knocked. Waited. No answer. She knocked again, this time louder. Still silence. Housekeepers at the Hampton Springs retreat were trained to respect privacy. But they were also trained to follow procedure. If a guest didn't respond by checkout time, staff were required to enter and confirm the room was vacant. The keycard beeped. The door clicked open. And then she screamed. Brielle Carter's body lay motionless on the floor. She wasn't in the bed. She wasn't in the bathroom. She was on the cold hardwood just a few feet from the door. Her arms were splayed out at unnatural angles. Her head tilted slightly to the side, her dark curls matted with blood. There was no sign of struggle in the room. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. Just stillness. Panic took over. The housekeeper stumbled back into the hallway, her breath coming in short gasps as she fumbled for her radio. Her voice shook as she called the front desk, her words breaking apart between heavy breaths. Within minutes, the resort's manager was on the scene, followed by security. They knew immediately this wasn't a medical emergency. This wasn't a guest who had suffered a heart attack or a tragic accident. There was blood. Too much blood. At 10:53 a.m., the front desk dialed 911. The recording of that call would later be played in court. Oh my God, there's a woman in room 214. She's not breathing. Please, we need someone here now. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. They had handled calls like this before. They asked questions. Was the victim conscious? Was she breathing? The answers were no. No, she wasn't. Emergency responders arrived at the Hampton Springs retreat at 11:07 a.m. The paramedics moved quickly, but one glance was enough to confirm what everyone already knew. Brielle Carter was dead. A senior investigator from the Suffolk County Police Department was among the first officers on the scene. Years of experience told him this wasn't just an overdose. This wasn't a slip-and-fall injury. This was something else. Something deliberate. One of the responding officers would later recall his first impression of the room. From the moment we stepped inside, we knew this wasn't just an accident, this was murder. There were no signs of forced entry. No shattered locks. No broken windows. Whoever had been inside that room had been there with Brielle. They had walked in unnoticed. And when they left, they made sure she would never walk out again. A guest had checked into room 214 2 days earlier, looking for peace. Instead, she had become the victim of something calculated. Something cold. Something that had been waiting for the right moment. And by the time the police arrived, the person responsible was already gone. 2 years before the morning Brielle Carter was found dead at the Hampton Springs retreat, she was standing in the center of a crowded art gallery in Manhattan. It was one of those nights where success felt within reach. A fundraiser filled with collectors, critics, and curators, the kind of people who could make or break an artist's career with a single endorsement. Brielle wasn't just another face in the crowd. She was the moment. Her work had started gaining attention. Not just for its technique, but for its message. She painted about identity, about struggle, about the weight of being seen but not truly understood. The art world was beginning to take notice. And on that night, so was Malcolm Rhodes. He wasn't an artist. He wasn't a critic. But he had influence. A man with money, power, and connections that extended far beyond the gallery walls. His name carried weight in the industry. He had a history of backing artists, funding exhibitions, getting the right people to pay attention. When he spoke, doors opened. To those watching, Malcolm's interest in Brielle was expected. She was talented. She was fresh. And most importantly, she was independent. She hadn't been molded by the industry yet. She hadn't learned to play by its rules. And that made her valuable. By the end of the night, he had introduced himself. He had made her an offer. Sponsorship. Support. Whatever she needed to take her career to the next level. No strings attached. At first, Brielle was hesitant. She had built everything on her own. She wasn't sure she wanted to owe anyone anything. But Malcolm had a way of making people feel comfortable. He wasn't just another investor looking for a name to attach himself to. He spoke about her work with a level of depth and understanding that was rare. He wasn't just offering money, he was offering guidance, mentorship, protection. And in an industry where so many doors remained closed, the idea of having someone on her side was hard to ignore. She accepted. At first, everything was exactly as promised. Malcolm was generous. He funded her first solo exhibition. He connected her with collectors who had never even heard her name before. He made introductions that would have taken her years to make on her own. With Malcolm's backing, Brielle was suddenly everywhere. Her work was in demand, her voice amplified. She was finally living the life she had worked so hard for. But there was something else. It started subtly. A text here. A call there. Small things that could have been mistaken for genuine concern. Let me know when you get home. Be careful who you trust in this industry. Some of these people don't really understand your work the way I do. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't alarming. But it was always there. Over time, the concern turned into expectation. Malcolm wanted updates on everything. Where she was. Who she was with. He had opinions about her career, her choices, the way she presented herself. If she ignored a call, another would follow. And another. If she made a decision without consulting him first, he would remind her of everything he had done for her. Everything she wouldn't have without him. Her friends noticed the shift. Brielle had always been independent, but now she second-guessed herself. When people asked about Malcolm, she brushed it off. He's just protective, she would say. He wants what's best for me. But in private, she admitted something else. That sometimes she felt like she owed him more than she was willing to give. She was grateful for his support. She wouldn't deny that. But there was something about the way he watched her, the way he inserted himself into every aspect of her life that made her uneasy. She told herself she was imagining it, that he was just invested in her success. But the feeling never went away. Then her career truly took off. The media started paying attention. Then, one night, she received a message that changed everything. It was short, simple, but heavy. You think you can just walk away from me? She didn't respond. She turned off her phone. She tried to convince herself she was overreacting, that Malcolm was upset, but he would get over it, that it wasn't as serious as it felt in the pit of her stomach. But deep down, Brielle knew the truth. Malcolm wasn't used to losing, and in his mind, she wasn't just an artist he had supported. She was his investment, and she was making the mistake of trying to take herself back. Less than a week later, Brielle Carter was dead. Brielle Carter had spent months trying to create distance. She changed her routine, kept certain details of her life private, and made sure Malcolm Rhodes was no longer the first to know about her career moves. But no matter how much space she tried to put between them, he always found a way back in. At first, it was subtle, a message here and there, disguised as concern. Then, as weeks passed, his tone shifted. The man who once praised her talent now spoke in demands. The calls, the texts, the messages, they didn't stop. And they weren't kind. You think you can just walk away from me? I gave you everything. You're not going to like what happens next. Friends noticed the change in Brielle. She was distracted, uneasy. She no longer lingered after events. She double-checked doors before locking them. She stopped sharing her location, even with those closest to her. When someone asked if she was okay, she would smile, brush it off, say it was nothing. But it wasn't nothing. The messages continued. The voicemails, more direct, more threatening. You think you can just use me and throw me away? I made you. She blocked his number. A day later, another message came from an unknown contact. Then another. Then another. She changed her email. He found another way. Then it escalated. At an art opening in Manhattan, Brielle was mid-conversation with a collector when she saw him, standing near the back of the gallery watching her. She hadn't invited him. She hadn't told him where she would be. And yet, there he was. She left early that night. It happened again. And again. A private dinner with a curator, Malcolm was there. A panel discussion she was speaking at, he showed up late, standing in the back, saying nothing, just watching. If she left early, he would follow her outside, lingering just long enough for her to know he was still in control. He never touched her. Never said anything out of line in public. But he didn't have to. His presence alone was a reminder. Then came the cafe. 2 days before her death, Brielle met a friend at a small cafe in Brooklyn. It was meant to be an escape, a break from the stress of her work, from everything happening with Malcolm. But before she could even take a sip of her coffee, he walked in. Her friend later described the look on her face, tense, exhausted. Like she already knew what was coming. Malcolm sat down across from her. No invitation. No greeting. He didn't need one. For nearly 20 minutes he talked. His voice low, controlled, but sharp enough that the few people sitting nearby took notice. Brielle barely spoke. She didn't argue. She just listened. Then Malcolm leaned in. His final words before standing up and walking away were heard by more than just Brielle. "You have no idea what I'm capable of." It was the last conversation they would ever have. Brielle Carter had spent weeks trying to regain control of her life. She ignored the messages, changed her number, avoided places she knew Malcolm frequented. But no matter how much she tried to remove herself, he was always there, lurking just beyond the edges of her world, waiting for a moment when she let her guard down. She wasn't sleeping. She wasn't eating. And for the first time in her life, the city she loved, the city she had built her career in, felt like a trap. On October 26th, she made a decision. She needed time, space, a place where she could be unreachable, even if only for a few days. She booked a last-minute stay at the Hampton Springs Retreat, a secluded luxury wellness resort in Watermill, New York. It was private, exclusive. No reporters. No unexpected visitors. No way for Malcolm to find her. Or so she thought. She checked in alone. No entourage. No friends. No distractions. Just silence. The kind of silence she hadn't felt in months. She spent the first day doing nothing but breathing. Sitting by the water, walking through the gardens, trying to convince herself that she was safe. That this was a reset. That when she left, things would be different. What she didn't know was that Malcolm already knew where she was. That while she was trying to escape, he was making sure she couldn't. On the evening of October 27th, Malcolm Rhodes was seen in Watermill, New York. A small town, not the kind of place he had any reason to be. There was no business here. No meetings. Nothing but the Hampton Springs Retreat. And one woman who had been trying to get away from him. At 8:17 p.m., security footage captured him entering the resort's lobby. He didn't have a reservation. He didn't check in. But he didn't need to. He walked with the confidence of someone who belonged, who knew exactly where he was going. There were no raised alarms. No calls to security. No one stopped him as he moved through the hallways, making his way toward room 214. Brielle never knew he was there. What happened next would never be fully seen. No security cameras in the hallways outside the rooms. No surveillance inside the suites. Just gaps, minutes unaccounted for, moments lost in the absence of a lens. But what was heard was enough. At 10:42 p.m., a guest in the room next door heard voices. A woman's tense. A man's low and controlled. It wasn't a fight. Not yet. Just a conversation. One that felt strained, tight with something unspoken. Then at 11:09 p.m. the tone shifted. Voices raised. A single loud thud. Silence. And then screams. They lasted for seconds. Maybe less. Then nothing. The guest hesitated. Listened. Tried to convince themselves they had imagined it. That it wasn't their business. That if something was really wrong, someone else would do something. But no one did. By the time hotel staff reached room 214 the next morning, it was too late. The morning of October 28th began like any other at the Hampton Springs Retreat. The air was crisp, the sun breaking over the quiet landscape. Guests moved through the resort, sipping coffee, beginning their day. Housekeeping staff made their rounds, knocking on doors, replacing linens. It was routine, until they reached room 214. Brielle Carter's checkout time had come and gone. There had been no requests for late departure. No sign of movement from inside. The knock at her door went unanswered once, then twice. When the door finally opened, the stillness of the room was shattered by a single, terrified scream. She was found on the floor near the bed. No signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing to indicate a break-in. Her body was limp, her face turned slightly to the side, her skin pale. Bruises wrapped around her arms, deep enough to leave fingerprints. And around her neck, the evidence was undeniable: discoloration, broken capillaries. She had been strangled. Emergency responders were quick to arrive, but the conclusion was immediate. Brielle had been dead for hours. Long before the first knock on her door. Long before anyone even suspected something was wrong. As investigators surveyed the room, they noted what wasn't there: no signs of forced entry, no stolen belongings, no shattered locks or broken glass. Whoever had been in that room had been there with her permission. She had let them in. A search of hotel security footage provided the first major break in the case. At 8:17 p.m. the night before, Malcolm Rhodes entered the resort's lobby. Alone. He didn't check in. He didn't go to the front desk. Instead, he moved with precision, walking past the concierge and toward the private guest quarters. Surveillance confirmed it. He was there. But the most damning piece of evidence wasn't caught on camera. It was recorded in the hotel's key card log. At 11:32 p.m., Malcolm Rhodes used a key card to enter Brielle Carter's room. There was no record of him leaving. The next morning, when her body was found, Malcolm was already gone. With evidence mounting, authorities moved quickly. Brielle Carter's death was no longer a mystery. It was a murder. The surveillance footage, the bruises on her body, the key card logs, all of it pointed to one man, Malcolm Rhodes. By the time police obtained a warrant for his arrest, Malcolm was already gone. He had left New York in the early hours of the morning, just hours after Brielle's body was discovered. His car was tracked heading south, crossing state lines into Pennsylvania. He wasn't running to hide. He wasn't making an effort to cover his tracks. He was going home. For the next 24 hours, investigators worked to locate him. Calls to his phone went unanswered. Family members claimed they hadn't spoken to him. His associates refused to comment. But by the afternoon of October 29th, Pennsylvania State Police had pinpointed his location. A private estate in Honesdale, a secluded property he owned away from the city. A place where no one would find him unless they were looking. At 3:27 p.m., officers arrived at the property. Their goal was to take Malcolm into custody, to bring him in for questioning, to give him the chance to explain himself. But as soon as they stepped onto the front porch, everything changed. There was no movement inside the house. No sound. No sign of life. Bodycam footage from the lead officer recorded what happened next. The team announced themselves. Knocked once. Then twice. No response. When the door was forced open, what they found was nothing short of final. Malcolm Rhodes was slumped in a chair in the center of his study, a gun in his right hand, a single gunshot wound to the head. The room was silent except for the sound of the wind outside. There was no note placed neatly on the desk, no last-minute confession recorded on a phone, just a single piece of paper, barely crumpled, found near his feet. It read, "If I can't have her, no one will. She was mine. She owed me." It was the last thing Malcolm Rhodes would ever say. Investigators never got to interrogate him. There would be no trial, no jury, no sentencing. The case was closed before it had even truly begun. But the evidence remained. The messages, the surveillance footage, the key card logs, the bruises on Brielle's body, the timeline that led her from a career on the rise to a final desperate attempt at escape. And a man who refused to let her go. With Malcolm Rhodes dead, there would be no trial. No cross-examinations, no witnesses called to the stand, no final verdict delivered by a jury. The legal process that should have given Brielle Carter justice ended the moment he pulled the trigger. But the evidence left behind told a story that needed no courtroom to be understood. Investigators pieced together the events leading up to Brielle's final days with a clarity that left no doubt. The messages he sent, the threats veiled as warnings, the way he followed her even after she had made it clear she wanted nothing more to do with him. The key card records showing him entering her room, but never officially checking into the hotel. The bruises on her arms, the pressure marks on her neck. Indisputable proof of a struggle of control being taken from her in the most violent way possible. Experts who reviewed the case agreed on one thing: this was never about love. This was about power. An obsession so consuming that Malcolm refused to let Brielle exist without him. And when she chose to walk away, he made sure she wouldn't get the chance to live without his presence lingering over her. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the lack of a trial left a void. Brielle never got her day in court. The weight of Malcolm's actions would never be tested by a judge, his crimes never dissected under the scrutiny of the law. There would be no defense, no prosecution, no sentencing. Instead, the case file was closed, classified not as a murder trial but as an open and shut case of domestic homicide followed by suicide. But for those who knew Brielle, for those who followed her work, for those who had watched her fight her way into an industry that had not been built for her, there was no closure. The absence of a courtroom did not mean the absence of accountability. The evidence alone told a story that could not be ignored. The text messages, the footage, the history of control disguised as generosity. The final note that stripped away any illusion that this had been anything other than possession. Malcolm had viewed Brielle not as a person, not as a woman with a life of her own, but as something he could claim. And when she refused to belong to him, he ended her life to make sure no one else could have her. Without a trial, there was no sentence. But there was an undeniable truth: Brielle Carter had been murdered. And Malcolm Rhodes, whether or not he had lived to face the consequences, would forever be known as the man who killed her. With Malcolm Rhodes dead, the legal system had no more work to do. No trial, no sentencing, no final statement from a judge. The case was officially closed. But a closed case does not mean a forgotten one. Because the chilling details remained. Brielle Carter had been murdered by a man who had spent years weaving himself into her life. A man who had positioned himself as her protector, her benefactor, her advocate. A man who, in the end, had decided that if he could not control her, he would destroy her. And then, before the world could fully grasp what he had done, he took the one thing that could have held him accountable: his own life. But death does not erase guilt. And it does not erase the questions left behind. Because for those who knew Malcolm Rhodes, for those who had crossed paths with him before, Brielle's murder felt less like a shocking tragedy and more like the final chapter in a story that had been unfolding long before her name ever entered it. In the days following his death, whispers turned into confessions. Women who had once known Malcolm began speaking up. Some on record, some only in the safety of private conversations. Their stories, though different in detail, carried the same thread: a man who was generous, charismatic, powerful. A man who knew how to make you feel special, chosen. A man who, once he had given you something, expected something in return. None of these women had died at his hands. None had suffered the final fate that Brielle had. But they had felt the weight of his control, the pressure of his expectations. And some had spent years trying to escape the grip of a man who had made it clear that walking away was never truly an option. The question was no longer just about Brielle Carter. It was about how many others had been close to the same fate. How many women had felt the walls closing in, the way she had? How many had changed their numbers, stopped answering calls, watched over their shoulders in fear? And how many had lived with the knowledge that they had been one step away from becoming another name in a case file? The chilling truth was that Brielle may not have been Malcolm's first obsession. She was only the one the world had been forced to see. And yet, even with that knowledge, even with the evidence that painted a picture of a man whose need for control had gone unchecked for years, there was no real justice to be found. Brielle was gone. Malcolm had stolen the chance for the world to hold him accountable. There would be no sentencing, no prison cell, no final moment where a judge would declare what everyone already knew, that Malcolm Rhodes was guilty. And so, the world was left with only echoes. The messages he had sent. The threats disguised as affection. The final note left at his feet, scrawled in a last act of dominance. But one final piece of evidence remained, one that, for a long time, was kept from the public. A voicemail. A recording left on Brielle Carter's phone in the days before she died. A message she never responded to, but one that, in the end, said everything. The voice was unmistakable. The words were few, and yet, they carried the weight of what was to come. You think you can leave me? No one leaves me. For Brielle Carter, there was no escape. But in the wake of her death, her story did not fade into silence. It became a warning. A reminder that obsession is not love, that power is not protection, that the most dangerous threats are often the ones disguised as devotion. and that sometimes the people we trust the most are the very ones we should fear. At what point does love become obsession? At what point does admiration become control? And at what point does a protector become a predator? Brielle Carter had spent her life creating. She had built something from nothing, carved her place in an industry that rarely made room for women like her. She had fought for every opportunity, every success. She had earned everything she had. But in the end, none of it mattered. Because no amount of success, no amount of talent, no amount of independence could protect her from the one thing she never saw coming. A man who believed that her life was something he had the right to own. Malcolm Rhodes did not kill Brielle in a moment of passion. He did not act on impulse. He did what men like him have done for centuries. He took something that was never his to take. He saw her strength, her ambition, her ability to exist without him, and he made a choice that would silence her forever. And yet, despite his efforts, despite the way he tried to erase her, Brielle Carter's story did not end with her last breath. Because now, she is more than just a victim. She is a name that cannot be ignored. A name that forces a conversation many would rather avoid. A name that reminds us that control is not love, and that power in the wrong hands can be deadly. There will be no justice in the traditional sense. No verdict, no sentencing, no moment where a courtroom declares the guilt we all already know exists. Malcolm Rhodes escaped the consequences of his actions in the only way he knew how, by making sure he never had to face them. But in doing so, he left behind the very thing he feared most. The truth. The truth that he was never a protector, never a mentor, never the man he pretended to be. He was a man who saw a woman thriving without him and could not accept it. A man whose love was nothing more than control. A man who, when he could no longer manipulate, chose to destroy. One thing is for sure, Brielle Carter never got the chance to tell her side of the story. But tonight, we tell it for her. If you found the story important, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into cases like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think about this case? Should more have been done before it was too late? And if you want to support the channel, share this video with others. Stories like Brielle Carter's deserve to be heard. We have more cases coming soon, real stories that need to be told. Stay tuned and we'll see you in the next one.